Swing states moving right and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. This podcast is called Swing States Moving Right. And we do have a dumbest bill in America, which seeks to outlaw certain words that you can't say. Yes, and of course, it's from California. So swing states are turning away from the Democrats, podcast listeners. That should not come as a surprise given the state of the economy. Democrats are in trouble in the Patriot Journal. 2 swing states 2022 polls show their luck might run out in Michigan and Florida. If Democrats are going to survive in the future, they need more than Portland and Chicago to support them. They need to maintain a hold on swing states if they hope to make it through 2022. But they don't seem to be doing what it takes to win over the folks in these areas. Moderate House Democrats see the writing on the wall. Idiots like AOC keep shooting their mouths off, upsetting millions of Americans. If the party keeps bowing to the far left, many voters will basically just turn away. And so, as you can imagine, the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee raises money to elect Republicans. And they've already put out an ad. I'm going to play the ad for you. Between you and me, I don't think it's the best ad. They think it's the best ad ever. But it does highlight the fact that all you really need to do in politics is to remind people of how the basic things that you expect every day to work are no longer working. And that's precisely what this ad is doing. And we're going to play this ad for you, and here it is.
Sometimes even politicians tell the truth.
Guess what? If you elect me, you're not going to have your taxes are going to be raised, not cut.
Prices are going up, paychecks are going down. Now, Biden, Pelosi, and Cindy Axne are going to make things worse with the biggest tax hike in decades, crushing small businesses and hurting middle-class families. Tell Cindy Axne we can't afford this.
House GOP re-election arm linking Democrats facing tough 22 election to increasingly unpopular president. Yeah, so that's what that ad was about. Of course, it's trying to link. The visual is you're seeing Biden in the background. Of course, he's kind of speaking, but you can't hear him speak. And they're showing there's inflation, gas prices, lumber prices. Your wages, your real wages are actually going down if you have inflation that is in excess of 3.5%, 4%. We all know that inflation is at least that and probably more, especially depending on what part of the economy you're going to. And when you expect the basic things, podcast listeners, in the economy to work for you, and they stop working, something as simple as gas prices and food prices, people start looking at that and they're like, okay, well, will there be any end in sight? And so sometimes simple ads like this just remind people of how poorly the economy is being managed by Biden and the congressional Democrats. So in Fox News, it says a new ad blitz by the National Republican Congressional Committee that targets House Democrats potentially facing difficult re-election bids next year has a new villain, President Biden. Quote, prices are going up, paychecks are going down, says the narrator in a digital ad by the NRCC. Now Biden, Pelosi, and Cindy Axne are going to make things worse with the biggest tax hike in decades, crushing small businesses and hurting middle-class families. Tell Cindy Axne we can't afford this. Axne, a 2-term congresswoman who represents a district covering parts of central and southwestern Iowa, is one of dozens of House Democrats taking incoming fire from the NRCC as Republicans need a net gain of just 5 seats to win back the House majority in the 2022 midterm elections. Keep in mind, by the way, podcast listeners, that in the state of Iowa, Biden is so upside down in the polls that he's actually below 40%. So if you're a Democrat and you are elected in any district that is even remotely swing, and you are in a state where the president is on the same party as you, has the same party affiliation, and he has less than 40% of the popular vote or popular support in the polls, you're probably not going to be long for this world. And so that's why, of course, the Republicans are putting these ads out there. This is one of many, and they're trying to soften up the support, although the support already is soft. And the support is also soft because of things like the border. Simple things, podcast listeners, that you think should work are ceasing to work, right? I mean, you think that gas prices would be lower and they would be consistently lower no matter who the president is, and then policy changes intentionally to raise gas prices. And then the same thing with the border. You assume you live in a country where you have borders and where citizenship matters, and then those things cease to work. And then you start to look at yourself and you say, well, can I really vote for the people that have allowed this to happen? So in the New York Post, Al Sharpton went to the border in Del Rio, good old Al Sharpton, and he was heckled during his press conference at the migrant camp. So the Reverend Al Sharpton was forced to cut short a press conference near the migrant encampment at Del Rio, Texas, Thursday, after he was repeatedly heckled as he tried to speak. Sharpton, the founder of the National Action Network, toured the area around the International Bridge, which links Del Rio with Mexico. I'm not going to say that town because my French is a lot better than my Spanish. And under which thousands of migrants, many of them originally from Haiti, had congregated in recent days. New York Post, it's calling them migrants. Notice how this is happening in all the papers, including the more right-leaning papers. They're saying migrants and not illegal immigrants. The heckling, which the Washington Examiner reported, came from at least two men in the audience, began as Sharpton introduced members of his traveling party and continued as he spoke about what he saw on his tour. How much money are you making out of this? Asked one heckler. And so the heckling just went on. And as you can imagine, Al Sharpton went to the border because he tried to make gains on the fact that there were some in the media who were saying that border agents, the Border Patrol on horses, were hitting people with whips, which of course has been debunked and is not true. Nonetheless, Sharpton went to the border anyway, because that's what you do when you are a race baiter, a professional race baiter, because that's how Sharpton makes his money, right? He race baits and then he raises money on the race baiting. He's done this his entire career. And the guy's a tool. Here's the problem. He goes to Del Rio and it's like, dude, you're not in New York anymore, right? You're not in Chicago anymore. You're not in Los Angeles anymore. You're in Texas. And in Texas, people don't appreciate this junk, this crap that you're trying to sell. And so there are plenty of people who are there protesting and heckling Sharpton, which was terrific, right? Because Sharpton isn't used to that. The left isn't used to people heckling them. They're not used to being called out while their false statements are being made. But that's exactly what happened in this particular press conference with Al Sharpton. By the way, podcast listeners, the individuals predominantly heckling Sharpton were Hispanics, and we're going to explain why. Here is the clip.
Why are you stoking racism where it doesn't exist? Why are you trying to come and provoke violence? Why are you here advocating for violence? Why are you here advocating for violence? Del Rio is not a racist city. Del Rio is a loving, caring community. We don't want your racism in Texas. Get out of here. Nobody wants to hear your racist nonsense in Del Rio. You're a disgrace. You're a racist. Nobody wants you in Texas. Nobody wants you in Texas. Why are you not a voice for the children that have gone missing at the border? Where are your voice then? Get out of your racism. Get out of your first racism.
So that's Al Sharpton at the border. And as you can tell, he's just getting lambasted by protesters who are heckling him and just making fun of him. And many of those protesters are Hispanic Americans. They live in those Texas border towns. They are American citizens. They also happen to be of Hispanic heritage. And they're tired of the fact that they have people who they don't even know trespassing on their properties and leaving trash and going to bathroom on their property. It's disgusting what's happening, because this is what happens when you don't have borders. You have anarchy. And Al Sharpton, of course, makes money by creating anarchy and saying, oh my gosh, everybody has a right to be here. And after all, we have these people who are being hit simply because of the color of their skin, which wasn't true. And he got a little bit of his own, because this is what this guy does no matter where he goes. He always stirs it up and good for you, Texans, for going there and stirring it up with Al Sharpton. If anyone deserves it, it's this race baiter, Al Sharpton. So next up, podcast listeners, a college professor calls voter ID laws racist. So there actually were several college professors who were on the left, as you might expect, because they are college professors. And they were in the United States Senate testifying on voter ID laws, specifically the Democrat law, I think it's the For the People Act, which intends to, if passed, create a nationalized election. And of course, among other things, get rid of voter ID in the states, even though the states run their own elections and get to determine constitutionally how their elections are run. Some states require voter ID, other states do not. Doesn't matter. These professors are for the People Act, which means they're against the Constitution of the United States. And they show up to the United States Senate and they testify with a straight face, by the way, kind of. And they're saying, well, voter ID laws are wrong. Yeah, I don't support voter ID laws, is what they are saying. This is what they are saying. So one such professor is Franita Tolson. So Franita Tolson is a professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. And on their website, it says she is Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She holds a courtesy faculty appointment in the Political Science and International Relations Department at the USC Dornsife College of Letter Arts and Sciences. Her scholarship teaching focuses on the areas of election law, constitutional law, legal history, and employment discrimination. She has written on a wide range of topics, including partisan gerrymandering, political parties, the Elections Cause, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the 14th and 15th Amendments. So she is a supposed expert on constitutional law and legal history and election law. Election law. Nonetheless, we have a series of clips where Senator Ted Cruz basically grills her in the Senate about her opposition of voter ID laws, and he does the same thing to a number of other professors and so-called experts. First up, here is Senator Ted Cruz asking, are voter ID laws racist? And this is Professor Franita Tolson responding after Cruz asks the question. We have that clip, and here it is.
In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent.
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist.
So that is Professor Franita Tolson, who is a law professor, saying, well, the voter ID laws in Texas are racist. And then, of course, she backs off. And here's what's interesting, podcast listeners. When you watch the video, this professor, who's never used to being challenged, because by definition, she's a professor in academia, and no one in academia would ever think of questioning her in public and in any way disagreeing with her, because she would fail them if it was a student, of course. And if it was another professor, she would probably call racist, because that's what she's saying about voter ID laws. She looks so nervous and is so nervous when you look at her body language, because she's not used to being asked questions and being held to account and trying to quantify in any way, shape, or form why voter ID laws are racist. So then Ted Cruz asks two other professors, John C. Yang, also on the left, and Thomas Syons, who also is on the left. He is technically, although he teaches here and there, he technically is not a professor. So John C. Syons, he is the president and general counsel of MALDEF, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Once again, these are two other individuals who are never used to being questioned in open public forums such as this, certainly not in front of the United States Senate. And now, of course, since you have Ted Cruz, who is asking them questions, they actually have to defend their positions. And it's really fascinating when you see a lefty trying to defend their position, which is indefensible, which is nobody should ever have to show their voter ID because they just shouldn't have to. Here's Cruz, clip number 2. Here it is.
How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tulsa. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's
other
2.
context.
Mr. Science?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about in practice? In intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist?
If the law that requires you to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
What about the
under
effect?
our
Set
Constitution.
aside intent. Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Yes, in effect, I think that
Ms.
there are
Reardon.
discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reardon.
I'm going to give the witness a chance to answer the question. Go ahead, Mr. Sine.
Yes, in effects, I think many voter ID laws are discriminatory. And in design, they are designed to have that effect.
So that was Thomas Sens, who was responding to Ted Cruz. And he's, of course, an expert, of course, in this subject matter. And yes, I think that the intent and the effect is that they are discriminatory. Just incredible that we are where we are today in the 21st century and still having to have this absurd conversation, which is so self-evident that you should be able to prove who you are. But then again, remember, if you are a Democrat and you don't believe in borders, why would you believe in voter ID? So there's that. So here's Cruz, Ted Cruz, asking Hans von Spakovsky, who's actually on the right, the same question about voter ID. And Spakovsky brings up a point that I've said before in this podcast, and we're going to underscore that, which is very important because it pretty much blows up the entire narrative of the left of why voter ID is so difficult and why it should not be allowed. Here's that clip. Here it is.
Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
Yeah, so it was not discriminatory, that particular voter law. And here's the other point. Do you know that every state that has a voter ID law in the United States will provide a free state-issued ID to you if you can't afford one? So once again, every state in the United States that has a voter ID law will provide you a free ID if you cannot afford one. My state in Maryland, we do that all of the time. And so when you have that one argument, well, what about people who don't drive anymore because they are older and they can't drive, or they are minorities and they can't afford a car, so therefore they don't drive? Well, you still need a state-issued ID, of course, in order to receive all different kinds of benefits in the state, as well as to get into sports venues many times now, as well as many other kinds of events, and or to be served in a bar. I mean, we can just go on and on and on. Or go to a doctor when the first thing they want to see, of course, is your insurance and then also your picture ID. But states will actually give you that ID for free. Typically, the ID is very inexpensive. It's $25. If you can't afford it, doesn't matter. They're still going to give you one. So you will get an ID, and that ID will work, and you'll be able to vote. So problem solved. But here's Ted Cruz summarizing this entire exchange with the professors on the left and the folks who support voter ID on the right. Does a great job. And we have a clip on that, and this is definitely worth listening to. Here it is.
And I've got to say, there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi, African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal.
So that's Cruz basically saying, hey, look, in the southern states, the voter participation of minorities is greater than it is in Senator Blumenthal, who's the chair of that committee's own state of Connecticut. Kind of funny that he called that out. And that's probably in part, podcast listeners, because in the state of Connecticut, there's really only one party. It's a one-party state. The party controls the legislature. The party controls the governor's office. The party controls the 2 U.S. senators and the congressmen and women. So it kind of makes sense that with a state like Connecticut, there isn't a whole big motivation to vote for anyone, because if you're black in Connecticut, the Democrat's going to win. And so unlike the South, where you have higher voter participation of minorities, which is interesting, and you also happen to have voter ID. So Cruz blows this entire argument out of the water, which is really hysterical, but that didn't work with CNN. CNN was watching this very closely. Podcast listeners, you're going to love this. So CNN expert, an expert on CNN, claims black voters don't have IDs because they can't get the underlying documents. They're just too hard to get. Even though, of course, the underlying documents, even when you can't pay for them, are free as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first up, we have good old Chris Grabatush Cuomo discussing Ted Cruz's questions and comments on voter ID. We have that clip, and here it is.
Now, let's move past the shame of Cruz playing such a silly game. Oh, you called the whole state racist. No, the professor didn't. She said, in response to his question about what laws, your state's law. It's a dirty trick because it's not about the law, even for a legal expert, because it's about something else.
This guy is probably one of the dumbest people on TV. I know you've heard others say this, including Tucker Carlson, but he really can't even speak to, and if you ever noticed that about CNN and MSNBC, they really can't speak to the specifics. It's just the law. It's the law. How about the specifics of the law and break down the specifics and the requirements and fix those specifics and requirements? The big one that states fixed many, many years ago was they'll pay for your ID if you can't get one, as I said before. But Chris Cuomo can't do that. So he brings on a so-called expert, and we have that exchange between Chris Cuomo and his expert talking about Ted Cruz. How dare Ted Cruz grill these professors on the left? We have that clip, and here it is.
How dangerous is it for the Democrats if they do not pass the voting rights bill that is before them?
It is awful darn dangerous. We got to stand up. Don't be feckless or spineless. Stand up and say this is wrong. We know this is wrong. We know that the people are doing this, rhetorical legerdemain, as Ted Cruz was doing today, this sleight of hand. You know darn well that this stuff does not have good intentions.
That's by the way, Professor Michael Eric Dyson. He's a Georgetown sociology professor. He's not an expert on election law, but he's a Georgetown sociology professor, and his name is Michael Eric Dyson. So Cuomo gives him, I'm sorry, this is so hard. Cuomo gives him a really simple question. How bad is this? It's really bad. I mean, it's like news reporting for dummies. It just gets worse and worse at CNN. And I have to bring up the voter ID law issues from time to time on Mark and the Millennials because, as you know, we still are, according to the Democrats and according to the CDC, in a pandemic. And remember, podcast listeners, of what they did last year during the pandemic, how they changed, the CDC and others changed, and the courts changed voter laws, effectively gutting voter ID across the country. And that worked really well for the Democrats. So they need to keep the pandemic alive just enough so that next year in the 2022 elections, they can do the same thing. It's why they're freaking out about voter ID now. Obviously, it was suspended last year in 2020, and in 2022, they want to suspend it again. So get this, podcast listeners, the school board speech police. That's right. We're going to do a segment on the school board speech police. So in the Daily Wire, a county in Virginia changes its rules so that podcaster Matt Walsh can't speak at the school board meeting. And Walsh finds a workaround. So a county in Virginia changed their rules at the last minute in an effort to block Daily Wire host Matt Walsh from speaking at an upcoming school board meeting. Walsh, however, found a workaround by leasing a property in the area. So he rented like an apartment. Walsh, who has tremendous support from parents, went viral last month when he spoke out against radical gender initiatives at a school board meeting in Loudoun County. Walsh posted earlier this month that the district has imposed a radical trans policy allowing males access to girls' restrooms and teams, adding that teachers are required to use preferred pronouns. Teachers are required to use preferred pronouns in public school of children, apparently attempting to avoid such a public spectacle of pushback. The county, Loudoun County, introduced some changes for public participation in the September 28th, 2021 meeting of the Loudoun County School Board. A portion of the press release states, those wishing to speak to the school board must provide proof that they meet these criteria. The following means of identification will be accepted. A valid Virginia driver's license indicating Loudoun County residency, in other words, voter ID. A utility bill, 2021, with a resident's name and a Loudoun County address. A mortgage or rental lease agreement displaying the resident's name and current street address of residency or business. A current employee ID or student ID. So what Matt Walsh did, he does not live in the state of Virginia, the podcast listener, he entered into a lease agreement with someone who has an apartment and he's renting it. And so he has a valid rental lease agreement that he provided to the Loudoun School Board, and they can't stop him now from speaking. Pretty smart. And so it's not just that the speech police in Loudoun County, Virginia are trying to shut down parents and other interested people from speaking up about the crazy policy changes and the crazy policy decisions that are happening in many public schools, such as CRT, for example. But there's more. There's also this movement in many public schools to teach pedophilia and to try to normalize it. Let's put it that way. Maybe not teach it, but to normalize it through assigning certain books that not only normalize pedophilia, but also kind of celebrate it. So in Fairfax County schools, that's also a very large county in Virginia that we've spoken about before. Loudoun County is as well. I mean, what's happening in Virginia? Stacy Langdon, a parent, speaks at a school board meeting about a number of books that are available to the students in their library and elsewhere, readily available, very easy to find. Remember, libraries and schools are very small. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of books in these libraries. And so as a result of having limited space, the librarians in the schools and teachers in the schools, not all teachers, not all librarians, but certainly some, have made certain books available to children. And here is a parent talking about what some of those books are about. Here's the clip.
After seeing a September 9th school board meeting in Texas on pornography in the schools, I decided to check the titles at my child's school, Fairfax High School. The books were available, and we checked them out. Both of these books include pedophilia, sex between men and boys. Both books describe different acts. One book describes a 4th grade boy performing oral sex on an adult male. The other book has detailed illustrations of a man having sex with a boy. The illustrations include fellatio, sex toys, masturbation, and violent nudity. Pedophilia here. From the author, Maya Kobabe, quote, "I can't wait to have your cock in my mouth. I am going to give you the blowjob of your life, and then I want you inside me," end quote. From the author, Jonathan Evison, "What if I told you I touched another guy's dick? What if I told you I sucked it? I was 10 years old, but it's true. I sucked Doug Goebel's dick, the real estate guy, and he sucked mine too." This is not an oversight at Fairfax High School.
May I please make a point of, there are children in the audience here.
Do not interrupt my time. Do not interrupt my time.
So that's the Fairfax School Board saying there are children in the audience, but it's like, yeah, but you're making the books available to the children in the public school system, which has nothing to do with education. Nothing. In fact, it has to do with normalizing and celebrating pedophilia. And there's the other thing, too, which is the school board is like, well, you know, free speech, but you can't talk about this, not in front of the rest of us. We don't want to hear this. But it's okay if kids read it. Incredible. This is happening across America. And while Republicans and conservatives, and by the way, this includes regular, everyday families that were never politically active before in their lives, while they were asleep at the wheel, the left has made a concerted effort to take over school boards nationwide. And this is the kind of crazy stuff that they're putting into place. Case in point, in my own school board in Calvert County, Maryland, the school board shut down public comment during the entire pandemic. Okay? In other words, the school board continued to meet via Zoom, but they wouldn't allow parents to testify via Zoom because of COVID. You might get COVID when you testify remotely with Zoom. And so then, the beginning of this year, the same school board, my school board, decided, well, we're going to start meeting in person again, but we're going to limit comment to only 10 parents. Not 10 parents at a time, and then the other 10 parents have to wait outside. No, 10 parents, period, because they don't want to hear what the parents have to say, even though the parents are the ones not only that pay the taxes, but children belong to the parents. This is happening across the country. School boards are on autopilot. They don't think they are answerable to anyone. And let me tell you something, they're going to be answerable. Well, here in Calvert County, Maryland, a commissioner said, hey, look, a county commissioner, which is the elected body that runs the county, there are 5 of them, all 5 commissioners went in front of the school board. They said, hey, among other things, you need to allow parents to come here and speak, and it needs to be unfettered. And you need to lift that limit of 10 parents, because many times we've had parents come here and you haven't allowed them to speak. And so the school board president responded. We have that clip, and listen to her response. Here it is.
I will thank the commissioners for bringing that issue up. And I will say that as president of the board, we will continue to discuss our maximum that we have placed on public comment. We do hear the concerns from the commissioners about our limit, but we have followed in suit on what the State Board of Education does in limiting their public comment, because our meeting is a business meeting, and so we do not, want to belabor our business portion of our meeting because there are 300, 400, or 60 to 100 commenters being given 3 minutes apiece, so that it does not put us here late, 2 a.m., 3 a.m.
Yes. So the meeting is a business meeting only at the school board. And, you parents, you're very pesky. And we don't want to be here until 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning listening to you speak, because what we have to do in our business meeting is far more important than what you have to say and commenting, even though the whole purpose of the school board is to be the conduit of parents in the way it administers policy to the public school system. But they don't want to listen to the parents. You got to love that. Moreover, podcast listeners, the same individual who's Black also wants to implement CRT in Calvert County Public Schools. And listen to me about this. This is happening across America, including my own county. So listen to this, podcast listeners. This individual happens to be Black. She was elected to the school board by what? Republicans. It is a Republican county. So a Republican county elected a Democrat who is Black. The Democrat gets elected telling people the good things that she's going to do. She gets there and the first thing she does is to try to implement critical race theory. And she wants to continuously shut down public schools because of COVID, and doesn't want to implement simple testing policies to try to find different ways to keep the schools open. And last but not least, while all that was happening, and while you are a white privileged individual, because she really does believe that, even though she was elected by the primarily white Republican county, she sends her child to an elite private school. So let's summarize. She's Black. She was elected by Republicans, but the Republicans are engaging in white privilege, I guess, because they elected her. And then she doesn't want to hear what you have to say on the school board, but at the same time wants schools to be shut down because she's doing the bidding of the teachers union, and sends her child to an elite private school. This is classic Democrat politics. And this is why we, the people, need to speak up. We need to tell these school boards, I'm sorry, you have to listen to us. We are the ones who pay the bill. So next up, podcast listeners, Nancy Pelosi says she can't discuss numbers and dollars of the new $3.5 trillion spending bill. She says, let's not talk about numbers and dollars. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat California, said during an interview on Sunday that people should not be focused on the $3.5 trillion price tag of a social spending bill the Democrats are trying to ram through Congress. Pelosi made the remarks during an interview on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. The $3.5 trillion price tag associated with the bill has been called into question in the past, with the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimating that the bill's true cost would be over $5 trillion. Yesterday, the Budget Committee passed out the Build Back Better legislation at the full $3.5 trillion. Can you believe that? That was the number that was sent to us by the Senate and by the president, Pelosi said. Obviously, with negotiations, there will have to be some changes in that, the sooner the better, so we can build our consensus to go forward. When pressed about some moderate Democrats not supporting the bill, because of the cost, Pelosi claimed that it will be paid for as she tried to dismiss fears of inflation. Quote, it will be paid for, said Nancy. And that's the beauty of it. By having those in our economy and society who have not paid their fair share, paying their fair share, Pelosi said. So again, the Senate and the House, those who are not in full agreement with the president, right, let's see what our values, let's not talk about numbers and dollars, let's talk about values. Let's not talk about dollars. Let's not talk about affordability. Let's talk about values. Similarly, Democrat Congresswoman from Washington State, Pramila Jayapal, chairman of the Progressive Caucus, claimed during an interview on CBS News Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on Sunday that Democrats' $3.5 trillion social spending bill is a $0 bill. It doesn't cost anything. It's free money. Again, this is Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Democrat of Washington State. Listen to this clip, podcast listeners. Here it is.
Because if you want childcare, if you want paid leave, if you want to take on climate change, if you want to repair housing in this country, if you want to make sure people have health care, there's going to be a price tag that goes with it.
So it will be less than $3.5 trillion, as the speaker suggested?
Well, let's talk about what people want, and then let's come to the number from that. It's not just a random number. So if somebody wants less than $3.5 trillion, tell us what you want to cut. Do you want to cut the childcare? Do you want to cut paid leave? What is it you want to cut? And then let's figure it out from there. But President Biden also said something very important the other day, which is this is a $0 bill because it's going to be completely paid for with taxes on the wealthiest and the largest.
It's a $0 bill, she said, because, President Biden said it's a $0 bill because it's paid for because the wealthy are paying for this $0 bill that somehow costs $3.5 trillion, and some say could ultimately cost as much as $5 trillion over a period of years. So this is what it takes now to be a progressive in the House of Representatives. First, you have Nancy Pelosi, who's saying, well, the dollars don't matter. What matters are the values. And then you have Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who's saying, well, it really doesn't cost anything. You don't need to look at that because when something's already paid for, it really didn't cost anything. And that is how congressmen and women in the Progressive Caucus, which, look, I think pretty much constitutes the majority of Democrats now in the United States Congress. Because podcast listeners, we keep hearing this, right? Keep hearing the Republicans saying, we're going to knock off the moderate Democrats. The moderate Democrats who are elected are only moderate long enough until such time as they can move as far left as they can possibly move, because then they can get away with the voting. I mean, they're only temporarily representing their constituents. They would much rather be voting with this particular congresswoman as well as with AOC. And even Pelosi, who everybody says, well, at least we have Pelosi. We don't ever have AOC in charge. I mean, Pelosi thinks all of this spending is going to solve all of the world's problems. All of the world's problems, including, by the way, one of her favorite, which is childcare. You see how they play this game? The taxpayers should pay for childcare. The taxpayers should pay for cradle to grave welfare, cradle to grave for everybody, including people who are here illegally. And that really, believe it or not, kind of brings us to the dumbest bill in America, which I'll announce in a minute. But you're not going to believe this because there are words you can't say in America. And that brings us to the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. And it's the dumbest bill in America. And it is California bans the word alien. California is banning the word alien. California, in The Hill magazine, California is going to replace the word alien with non-citizen or immigrant in the state laws. California Governor Gavin Newsom on Friday signed into law a measure that will effectively remove the term alien from state laws in reference to residents who are not U.S. citizens, in a response to growing arguments that the word is outdated and offensive. The legislation, which was authored by California Assembly member Luz Rivas, Democrat, will replace the word with an alternative term like non-citizen or immigrant, according to an announcement from Governor Gavin Newsom's office. While state laws passed in 2015 and 2016 removed the word from the California Labor and Education Code, the measure signed by Newsom Friday will replace the term in all state laws. Think we're living in 1984? Orwellian times? Yes, we are. We have a clip of this, podcast listeners, and it's NBC News in the Bay Area reporting on this bill. We had that clip, and here it is.
The word alien will be removed from all California codes after Governor Newsom signed AB 1096 into law. The state law used the word alien, I should say, to refer to undocumented immigrants. In a statement, Newsom declared that as the nation's most diverse state, California is stronger and more vibrant because of immigrant communities. He called the word alien offensive and divisive. The bill suggests using resident, person, undocumented immigrant or person who is not a citizen instead.
So, I could just see the day comes when we have like aliens coming from outer space, and the Californians, half of whom are like dazed and confused all the time anyway. Like, oh, we can't call them alien. I mean, they're not really alien. I mean, the term alien is not a bad term. It is used for people who are not citizens of your country. And it's very clear and clarifying. But of course, the Democrat Party is trying to change the English language. So this bill number is Assembly Bill 1096, and it removes the derogatory term, alien, used to describe foreign-born individuals. Foreign-born individuals. So Assemblywoman Luz Rivas, this is a lady in California, she introduced AB 1096. It was now just signed. So she tweeted out, Governor Gavin Newsom just signed my bill, AB 1096, to remove the term alien from California law when referring to immigrants and non-citizens. Today marks a huge step toward and forward in the fight to dismantle institutional racism targeted specifically towards our immigrant communities. So now, according to this Assemblywoman, Luz Rivas, who just had her bill signed by Newsom, you are an institutional racist, and it's systemically racist to call someone who is not an American citizen an alien or an illegal immigrant. You have to call them what they are, according to her. So now we're racist when we're just trying to use something as simple as the English language. So here's Governor Gavin Newsom. It's a statement from his office concerning this bill. And he says, Governor also signs 5 additional bills to protect safety and immigration and from Californians and shore up protections against discrimination. Sacramento, continuing California's commitment to welcoming and diverse communities. I think he meant to say welcoming diverse communities. Governor Gavin Newsom signed a suite of bills today expanding the state's humane immigration policies by providing protections and support for immigrants, including a new law to replace the outdated and derogatory term alien, used to describe non-citizens in the California State Code. Quote, as the nation's most diverse state, we are stronger and more vibrant because of our immigrant communities, said Governor Newsom. Quote, this important legislation removes the word alien, which is not only an offensive term for a human being, but for far too long has fueled a divisive and hurtful narrative. By changing this term, we are ensuring California laws reflect our state's values. AB 1096, authored by Assemblymember Luz Rivas, will replace the word alien with language more reflective of today's legal terminology, such as non-citizen and immigrant. And of course, it goes on to virtual signal again and again and again in this particular statement from Governor Gavin Newsom. So as I said, podcast listeners, now we're going to use new words in the English language to refer to people who are illegally in the United States and should be deported, quite frankly, and should be required to come in legally. And we're going to use those words so that you are confused. And you're confused about really who is a citizen and who isn't. And of course, at the same time, we're going to make sure that we get rid of voter ID so that what? So that people who are here illegally and are illegal aliens can vote. But first, we need to call them something else. We need to call them something else, like migrants. Well, the migrants are working here, so why shouldn't the migrants be able to, vote? And why should the migrants have to show voter ID? And that is exactly what all of this is about, which is why we incorporated into this podcast the idea of voter ID and Ted Cruz talking about it, as well as all of the other issues that we talked about as well, which is to have a country that doesn't have borders, because that's how you flip the country and you put people who don't have the American experience in charge in just one generation. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. And that's it for the dumbest bill in America, of course, as well. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.